folks, you're listening to Race Matters, and I am Eddie Carson. We're here at WJOP, Joppa Radio 96.3. And like always, we're here to delve into the funk just a little bit, particularly as we talk about matters of race, culture, society, and to have just fun, easy conversations with folks as it relates to this. I'm excited about my guest today, and we're going to really learn a lot about her. And as we do this, we want you to lean in, to listen, to learn, and think about the things that you didn't know before you dialed into this episode and everything too. So I am excited to introduce Mindy Tsonas Choi to the microphone. Mindy, how you doing, my friend?
Hello. I'm doing well and so happy to be here with you today.
Oh, do you hear that flavor and that excitement and that energy? And that's one of the reasons why I asked my friend to join us and everything too. You know, folks, Mindy, and I'm gonna brag just a little bit because Mindy is a fascinating human being. And you want to talk about someone who is humble, empathetic, and just a soul person who particularly thinks about others, thinks about identity, thinks about what does it mean to be a community person and everything too. And oh, you can't go wrong with that. You know, Mindy, I'm going to start here, and I'm going to start what I know about you, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of fill in the blanks.
All right.
If that's okay. Yeah?
Sounds good, yes.
Okay. So we just had this conversation, and then I didn't know this, folks, because I always assumed Tsonas was a middle name. For some reason, my parents deprived me of a middle name. I do not have a middle. I am Edward Carson.
That's unusual.
It is. I have no middle name whatsoever. So, as you were sharing with me, you have two last names, Tsonas Choi. Help us understand that.
Wow, okay. So I've actually had many names in my lifetime. I am a transracial, transnational adopted person from the Korean diaspora, one of the largest international adoptee communities in the world, and the first country to adopt out intercountry. And I was part of the first wave of transracial adoptions way back when. And what most folks don't know is a great number of adoptions out of South Korea after wartime, which is what created much of the destabilization of communities, families, etc., and precipitated, so much family separation. We don't have access to our histories, to our records, to our names. So I was given a name. A name was made up for me. Records were made up for me. Paperwork to declare me an orphan when likely I had a family that just wasn't able to take care of me. And so my first foray into being named was really an institutional name. And Choi comes from that place. Because I do not know if my family ever named me. If I had an original name, there were no records with my relinquishment. I was an infant, about 11 months old. And when I came to this country and was adopted by my family, of course, I was given another name. So I became Melinda Ray Miller, and that was my adopted name. So for much of my life, I didn't really think that much about it, and I moved through the world as Mindy Miller. And when I got married, of course, I was given another name. So Tsonas is my married name. And in the last several years, while really reconciling with so many different identity shifts and decolonizing from a lot of systemic and internalized whiteness, I really felt like it was important for me to have a name that actually reflected my identity. Because moving through the world as Mindy Miller and then Mindy Tsonas, no one knew that I was Asian. So, and that for a long time was really problematic in many ways. And it also afforded me a lot of privilege in many ways.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yes, invisible privilege. So I really made the distinct choice a few years ago to change and incorporate my Korean name, even though it's not likely my original name or my family name. But it felt important to really reclaim that part of my identity.
I love the fact that you're really leaning into your identity, really looking to reclaim it when we talk about the challenges of decolonization, and we talk about, the many challenges, of course, of whiteness and the ubiquitous of that, especially in terms of how we frame that in this country and everything. It's unusual. I won't say it's unusual. That's a generalization, and my apologies to listeners and folks for making that generalization. But some folks struggle, particularly BIPOC folks, they struggle sometimes when it comes to getting to a place when they want to lean into their racial identity. I will speak from the perspective of, as a black man here, having grown up and lived in black communities and engaged with different black folks in different ways, that some of them are comfortable with just kind of easing through the flow, because by doing that, there's less challenges in navigating white spaces.
100%.
And yet you are owning and thinking about racial identity models here. You're owning that identity, knowing the challenges, by really moving away from one aspect of whiteness and leaning into your own racial identity too. How has that been? Has that been challenging for you? Has that been a learning process, something that you've had to mature into?
Absolutely. I mean, it's taken me half a lifetime to get here. I think the internalized identities that I grew up with were really just, I never thought about them very much, right? My proximity to privilege as part of a white family was just something I grew up with. It's like the soup, the water we swim in. So it wasn't anything that I really thought about at any depth until I got much older and really started to see the friction between how I showed up in the world, especially as I moved towards more cultural organizing and activism, and how it was really important to show up fully as myself. And that's a big part of my work, really unpacking how the world fragments us into our many pieces, and how so much of collective liberation and reclaiming one's and collective power is really about, confluence, is really about wholeness, is really about coming back to our full selves.
Again, a generalization here when I say that oftentimes white folks don't have to lean into these kind of narratives when they think about racial identity models. A lot of white folks don't even see themselves as being a part or having a racial identity model. When I was growing up, my world, particularly living in Montgomery, Alabama, it was black and white. I didn't go to school with any Asian students, for example. Didn't congregate, right? It was diversity for us was black and white, and that was particularly it. And then I remember in high school, early in high school, when the Rodney King situation took place in L.A., it became the first time I had to lean into the idea of, wait, hold on. There's tension between Koreans and black people. But how can that be the case? Because we're both, to some extent, in some ways, oppressed peoples. And yet, a lot of what happened, especially starting off in I think Rodney King was, 92 or something like that, really illustrated that tension that was there. What kind of memory or thoughts do you have on that situation, or that black Korean narrative that has oftentimes been created by colonizers within society to divide us, particularly to pit us against each other? And I say all that to say, as a historian, I'm fully aware, for example, thinking about Japanese history and Japanese culture, when the Japanese were forced into internment camps,
yes,
going back into the 1930s. And so what happened is a lot of black folks, especially out in the Western U.S. and L.A., kind of moved into those neighborhoods. But yet, as soon as the Japanese were allowed to navigate back into those spaces, you know, white folks out in California they were excited to have the Japanese back, and again, looking to displace black folks, elevating that tension that was there and everything too. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your perspectives on that narrative I just shared with you.
I definitely, where I'm sitting now, definitely not back when it was happening. I was just a teenager.
For the record, same.
Yes, yes. I did not have, a cultural lens back then, for sure. But, what I understand now is how divisive these narratives are intentionally, how colorism really shows up between races. And, there are plenty of folks that don't know that Asian people are people of color and assume that we are white. And that it's a little mind-boggling, right? But it really is also the way our culture lifts up the good Asian, the model minority.
Absolutely.
As we tend to often want us to show up in a certain way in our Asianness, right? That's not disruptive. That really upholds all the systems where, people with darker skin are more marginalized and people with lighter skin have more access to privilege. And yeah, you can see in these cultural and historical moments how these narratives actually play out in real time. And yeah, it just really is affirming of how the structures are so embedded in everything that we understand and all the way our culture moves forward.
So before I delve in even deeper into that narrative, there's so many things I want to ask you. I'm aware that, time is not endless and we could talk for days and days and days. Oh, easily. Two words you use, and I read this because I was on your website today and reading your bio. It's super impressive. And two words that you use that I'm not sure a lot of folks understand. The word transracial, and the other word you use in your bio was transnational. And you use both of those here. Help us understand, what does transracial and transnational mean?
Yes, thank you. I say those words so often that I don't think about that, but you're right, absolutely. So transnational means moving from one country to another, one nation to another nation. So me, as a Korean transnational adoptee, I emigrated from South Korea to the United States. Transracial means that you are moving culturally from one race, my own South Korean identity, to another race, meaning my life was really absorbed and acclimated into whiteness immediately. So it literally happened overnight. So that is a transracial experience when you move from one culture to another.
I've had the experience, of course, of having to lean into white spaces, growing up in one neighborhood, but really attending a predominantly white independent school growing up. And I've observed this among a lot of folks where it's easier to step away. The word a lot of folks like to use, and I don't know, I have problems with the word assimilation. And I can talk about my challenges and problems with assimilation for days, but I don't want to get into any type of intellectual academic discourse that'll take us down a rabbit hole.
Sure, I could definitely go there too.
Yeah, on my challenges there. But yet, there's something, though, that's easier, right? Speaking in terms of my experiences with black folks, sometimes people ask me, Eddie, why do you talk about race? Why do you lean into your identity so much? But yet, wouldn't it be easy if you just didn't bring these stuff up? Why don't we just, try to move away from this notion of seeing our racial differences, but yet adopting a notion of colorblind ideology, right? You went to white schools, you went to a white college, white graduate school, I work in white institutions, I am surrounded by whiteness. And folks would oftentimes tell me, wouldn't it just be easier for you to lean into whiteness more? In that way, you would probably be more accepted. And I say that because I've observed, particularly among black folks, that they some struggle, generalization, with this notion of blackness in order to fit into white spaces because it's easier. So you talk about your own transformation, your own growth in becoming aware, racially aware of your identity and everything too. But wouldn't it have been easier for you just to lean back into whiteness and operate in those spaces and not address the pointedness of your own identity?
That is a very complex question, for sure.
I always say I should be careful of these things I ask especially when I have brilliant folks like you on this, knowing about time and everything too.
Yeah, I mean, if the world were really just like one way or another, the answer would be yes, but it's so much more than that, right? It's not just about wanting to fit in. And of course, everybody has a need for belonging and safety, but it really is also about being in alignment with who you are. And even if I wanted to not focus on my race, the world constantly, every day, every minute reminds me of my race because of how the world is structured. So there's just no way. It is not possible. And what happened was, over time, when I was not as aware of my racial identity and had really conflicting views about my identity. I know there are often lots of transracial adopted people who do identify as white, which is, again, speaks to the complexity of internalized racism. And, the disparity of like looking in a mirror and remembering, oh yeah, that's right, I'm not white. It's really can be deeply, deeply internally disruptive, and it costs something to come out of the fog. And that's what they call it in transracial adoption. They call it coming out of the fog, when you come to consciousness about the difference of your race with your family, etc. And then, Pandora's box opens, and there's so many conversations that should be had that many adoptees don't get to have because of how tender those conversations are and complex. So, the simple answer is, of course, it would be easy to just not grapple with that, and also to be out of alignment with yourself. That is not easy, and that took a toll on me, and I didn't realize what a toll it took on me until, much, much later in hindsight, that it really was, I couldn't even belong to myself. So when I could belong to myself, that changed the trajectory of my life, for sure.
When you got to that point where you're really looking to lean into your identity, right? You're coming from a space of whiteness and wanting to own your own identity. Did you navigate to that particular point, or did you move through that trajectory because the world reminded you that you were different? Or was there this intrinsic hunger and desire, looking in the mirror, to discover who you were or who you are?
It was many factors, for sure. I think a big part of it was a path towards healing and reintegration and reclamation of my own culture. It's something I never had access to. As adopted people transnationally, we lose our culture, we lose our language, we lose our families, we lose our food. We lose more than just a mom and a dad. So there is, a big sense of loss that we are grappling with as adoptees. And for myself, that loss that was never acknowledged or addressed creates a lot of harm and trauma in your own internal system. So I think for me, it was really trying to reconcile my own healing that kind of put me on the path of where I am now.
And I think I know the answer to this. Again, I was all over your website and thinking about the artwork that you do, the various leadership roles, which we're going to get into here in a second. Do you meditate a lot?
I actually am not a meditator in the traditional sense. Like, I'm not a person who sits on a cushion and, observes my thoughts. But I think there's so many practices that I do participate in and use that are meditative, art being one of them.
I
for
figured
sure.
that, yes.
And, moving in nature, like there's a lot of things that definitely have those meditative qualities that I think are so important to being able to hold space for like a lot of complexity.
So let's talk about your work, okay? So tell us, what do you do professionally?
So I wear many hats as a cultural organizer. I'm also an art and healing justice worker, very much so. I work at intersections of adoption, of identity, of diversity, inclusion, belonging. I work within the queer community as a queer identified person as well. And as a person of color too. So I think there's so many different facets of my life that I think for a long time I was juggling and trying to work in one corner and then another, which again is very fragmenting and not the best way to show up. And so more and more I have been trying to integrate and overlap where I'm working into and have really integrative practices of social justice and community organizing and all of the things that I'm participating in across multiple spaces.
We think about intersectionality,
Yes.
and I'm trying to figure out what's the easiest way for folks listening who don't know what the word intersectionality mean. I guess I'm going to start off, and then I'm going to ask you to further delve into whatever I'm leaving off. I mean, we know, the term intersectionality was actually started off in a legal journal by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. I'm excited. I had the honor of hearing her speak at a conference recently in 2017 when I was out in the LA area. And, Kimberly Crenshaw kind of really came up with this term when she was studying the fact that there were women who were fired from their job, but yet they're trying to figure out, were they fired because they were identifying as female, but they were also women of color, particularly black women. And so she started wrestling with this from a legal perspective of thinking about intersectionality and the fact that we hold multiple identities. A lot of people, in my opinion, they've hijacked that term to say that intersectionality is all people with many different identities that's there. But yet Kimberly Crenshaw in her origination said it from a perspective of marginalized and oppressed peoples dealing with that. So now I'm going to pause and let you continue to probably tell me the things that I left out or should be added.
No, and I'm so grateful you brought up Kimberly's work because, it really speaks to how important it is to not leave out the piece about our proximity to privilege and power. That's really what it is about, is how our identities are positioned with the amount of privilege and power that we have access to. And, depending upon where our different intersections lie, we can really be positioned socially. I call it, social location, where we're located within culture. It really can either be problematic and condemning and confining, or it could be something that, when you have more access to privilege and power, you have more access to everything.
I first heard the term intersectionality, it's been around since 89, but it feels like it's only become somewhat more mainstream and out of academic circles probably around the time I heard the word, and that was, I'm going to say probably 2013, 2014, very recent is the first time I heard that term. How about you? Do you recall?
Yeah, I feel like it hasn't been in the social ethos for very long either. Really, I think especially in feminist spaces, and we talk about intersectional feminism as like this wave of feminism, this current activation point. I really feel like that is very new, like within the last 5 years or so, that we're really talking about how our identities in multiple ways in this way that speaks to intersectionality is really important and has to be recognized, or else we are leaving out an entire section of folks.
Yes. Well, and again, so your navigation into really grasping something that you've lived for a long period of time, did that language make a lot of sense to you? Was it too simple? Was it perfect? How did that help you continue to unfold in your own identity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think in many ways, if you pull it apart too far, it can definitely be fragmenting. Like it can separate you into your individual marginalized identities for sure. But it also, I think it's really helpful to understanding that we are so nuanced and we are so unnameable as just one thing, right? We are really grappling with many different things at the same time, and I think that term intersectionality really helps in that way to sort of identify and go deeper into those identities to understand where we fall and where we land and where we are bumping up against systems in many different spaces.
Folks sometimes they ask me about what identity do I lean into the most, especially getting back to that, and I always tell them, I lean into the fact that, I'm a black man, I'm black, and then I'm male, and yet along the way there are a couple other privileges that I do have. I'm able-bodied, right, and so that's a privilege. My maleness emboldens a level of privilege that I have too, but yet my blackness, particularly being a black male, makes me the poster child for levels of oppression and targetness within society. Do you get that question about your intersectional identities, about what identity do you lean into the most?
Not very often.
Lucky you. Lucky you.
I really find that that is another level of understanding in terms of structural racism that not everybody has, number one. And I think also most spaces that I roll through are, again, like segmented from one another. Like I'm either in the adoptee space, or I'm in the queer space, or I'm in the BIPOC space, I'm in the feminist space, right? It's pretty rare that I'm in an intersectional space where all of those identities are really embraced and present. So it's really upon me to like really bring my own wholeness to all the spaces, as I was saying earlier. But it's really complicated, and to like need to lead with certain identities in certain spaces, but then also to really, not try really hard not to leave parts of yourself behind, because I think that can be problematic.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's that authenticity, right? Be who you are, bring who you are forward,
yes.
Right? And to leave into that, because we know oftentimes that when we're asked to suppress and subjugate aspects of who we are, that creates a number of layers of trauma.
Yes, 100%.
That can be challenging to overcome and everything. You use the word space, and I love the word space, because space is really important. And, you being who you are, being the dynamic leader and activist and thought leader that you are, being speculative here, I imagine that you do not have to defend your identity much because of the kind of spaces you find yourself in. Am I off base there, where people kind of just lean into who you are, especially in those safe spaces? So I'm talking about safe spaces here.
So interesting you bring up space. And yes, I appreciate that word too. And I think like we've been grappling with this culturally, this idea about safe space and brave space.
Yes.
So, and I'm really wrestling with this idea that space, the way we orient inside of space, is from a very individual perspective. So when I come into a space, I'm thinking about my own needs, my own safety. And I don't believe there is any such thing as a safe space, because I don't think other people can provide safety for you at all levels, at all times. I think our needs for safety are constantly changing depending on who is in the room, the cultural context, the conversation, like everything. So, which is why, we sort of embraced this term brave space that was popularized by Mickey Scoppy Jones.
Yes. Thank you for, I appreciate that.
And I know there's some complexity and nuance with that as well, but, that idea of, again, leaning into space, having a little bit more awareness about how safety is created, but I am like really have been really playing with in my own work is how do we create belonging space, right? That space that's not created about one person's safety, and to be a facilitator, to be an organizer holding space and having everybody expect you to be the person to be creating that level of safety for them. It's just not possible. It's not doable. And we think about collective liberation. It is a co-creating process. And I think this is also true inside spaces. Like we need to co-create belonging, safety, braveness, all of that within the space together, not relying on one individual, one aspect to be providing that for us. We need to be actively in relationship and participating in creating those things with and for each other.
Wow. So just for the record, I'm going to go back and I'm going to replay this. In that last statement, I'm just going to sit down and script and write down quite a bit because it is so powerful, particularly in terms of the work that I do, especially as a DEI leader, as much as yourself, a facilitator of these conversations, really looking for ways to pull all folks into a space in which we can grow, we can learn, and we can honor each other in the ways in which we should. But one of the terms that has really manifested itself over the last year or two is that word that you use, belonging. And what I've seen is I've seen a lot of places, particularly spaces that I don't think are wholly safe spaces, and to your point, right, do those spaces actually exist, use the word belonging. And I've actually pushed back on who can subscribe to the notion of belonging because I feel like it's become somewhat performative. We're going to say we engage, we are a belonging community, we are engaged in this, but yet belonging, I feel, has to be earned. But maybe I'm wrong. So please correct me and tell me whether you agree, whether I'm wrong. Throwing belonging there, I get the invitational aspect, but yet sometimes I feel like it has to be earned.
I hear definitely what you're saying in that nuance with belonging. Like just because you roll out the welcome mat doesn't mean people actually feel like they belong in that space. I also think belonging from an etymological and cultural perspective, like it really comes from this idea language-wise about ownership, right? We're thinking about ownership, belonging to. And I'm really more curious about belonging with. That we are, again, we already belong together. This is my belief. And this is, really present in, if we roll back to many, 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 indigenous traditions, cultures from across the world, right? That we belong with one another, humans, animals, plants, the earth, right? We're all beings coexisting and we're interdependent. There is no doubt that we are all interdependent, and that is our belonging, that we belong collectively. But what has happened is systems of oppression and racism, capitalism have used belonging and leveraged it as a way to access power, to separate people, to separate resources, to, gain control and leverage us in our own, little atomized individual lives. And so this narrative, especially here in the West and the US, about, this rugged individualism is really problematic in that we are all just like grappling and struggling to be and survive on our own terms as one individual, when we really need to be collectively moving towards abundance, care, resources, liberation, all of the things.
Folks, you're listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson. This is WJOP, Joppa Radio 96.3. And I'm here with Mindy Tsonas Choi, and we're having a fantastic conversation. My mind is just it's spiraling right now, thinking about just the importance of language and naming things and situating aspects, particularly the positionality of why those things matter and everything too. So you mentioned your work with the queer community. Tell us more about that, and about that aspect of your identity, if you're comfortable doing that.
Absolutely, yes. I think it's interesting because I think as a queer person, my identity has definitely evolved and shifted over time. And queerness is such a vague term, and I kind of love it for that, right? Like, I don't really want to be pinned into one box or another. And I really think just as an entire human being, like my existence is queer and outside of the box. Like, I really do not subscribe to normative standards in any way, and am really divesting and pushing back against like how we create dominant narratives and culture that pin people into really specific positions. So my queerness is a place of joy and playfulness, and I'm lucky enough now just to be very newly named the program director for North Shore Pride here in Mass, which is amazing.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's the systems are present in every community, in every organization, in every space, and it's always my work to queer those spaces, no pun intended, literally, like to not subscribe to the same standards and the same ways of doing things that uphold these intersections of privilege and power.
How do folks support your work, particularly in terms of North Shore Pride and the work that's happening as we prepare for Pride Month that's coming up?
Yes. So we are definitely ramping up for all of our Pride festivities. We have on April 6th a drag brunch at the Cut in Gloucester that you can attend. It's going to be a festive, fabulous time. Absolutely.
I can attend. Okay, I'm going to be reaching out April 6th, okay?
April 6th, as well as many fabulous events to come. Our regular events during Pride Month. We have an Interfaith Alliance celebration at Tabernacle Church that we always have every year. Our parade and festival, which folks can definitely come out, watch, participate in. We're always looking for marchers and contingents to create fabulous floats and all kinds of things, and vendors to really reach out and engage and support our LGBTQIA plus community. It's a really fabulous, fun, wonderful, celebratory, joyful day on the 22nd of June. So come out for that for sure. And then we're always engaging in the community in different activities. We've got a cookout that's happening with the Andover Elder Services on June 6th, and we're doing a drag bingo for the senior LGBTQ community, which is so fabulous. And we need more intergenerational spaces for sure. Again, that's like breaking those boxes. So a million ways: donate, sponsor, come participate, all the things for North Shore Pride. And as for my own work, you can follow me at MindyTsonasChoi.com or Mindy Tsonas Choi on Instagram. That's where I like to hang out because it's a visual medium and I'm an artist and I like to play inside of that. So yes, those are all the things.
And for our listeners, is there, if they visit those places, you created a list of ways and events that people can lean in and support and do that?
Yes, there are links for sure.
So all of that information is there?
Yes.
So folks
on the North Shore Pride website, you've got all the information to participate in the parade and festival, to be part of our events, and all the ticket information and things like that.
I recently got an email from them, and I do promise not only just a donation, but to show up and everything too.
Amazing.
Those things, I mean, it's always important to show up, particularly in your own community events and supporting community folk such as yourself and others. Versus, and I'll admit, I'm the first one who runs down to Provincetown, runs down to Boston, and yet we have all of these wonderful things happening right here.
Right
in our backyard, absolutely.
Yes.
But a lot of folks are aware of your work and this happening. Would you say that's correct? Or?
I think so. Yeah, I think so for sure. And we are also, as part of North Shore Pride, we're definitely helping to organize all the organizers of the individual towns who are doing Pride events and have Pride efforts happening in the individual North Shore towns. So that's a real honor and privilege to be able to work with all of those organizers as well, and helping to lift up their work too.
You're a busy person. I mean, busy.
I think I'm passionate, and I try not to be busy. I feel like busy is a capitalist
You know what? That's
framework.
fair. And you're absolutely right. Right. That's the word we tell folks so they know how important or what's going on, or
Sure.
all of those things that are being engineered in that way too. Mindy, we are down to the last couple minutes here. And one of the things that I like to do is I always like to give my guests the last thought, the last voice, to share, to express anything that they may feel that's resonated, within their soul, their heart, their mind. So I want to turn the mic over to you and say, you have the last take. What's on your mind?
What's on my mind? I think that I am also always a we. Right? And I don't just mean me, I mean all of us as we are always also a we. So to really think about and engage with and participate in, leaning on, not just doing for oneself, right? I feel like we've been in this age of self-awareness, self-care, self-love, self-education, and all for what, right? It's really for being in community, for lifting each other up, for getting each other free. Like, we are always an us.
Outstanding. Folks, thanks for chiming in. This is Race Matters, and you're at WJOP 96.3 FM Joppa Radio. We will see you next time.